it's not only the streets that are being cleaned up. There have been a sweep of dissidents in the past few days, and that has happened almost every major event in Cuba, so that there's not a lot of showing of unhappiness in Cuba. And there are a lot of issues on the U.S.-Cuba agenda that the president will have to deal with, and he is always Cuba unless he could move forward the idea of people-to-people contact, engagement, democratization of Cuba, and that's one thing he is going to make is a speech on human rights. Now, there's already been a little bit of a flap, and the day before he arrived yesterday, there was a speech by Cuba's foreign minister saying, we're not going to be listening to you on our domestic policies. So it's very clear that there will be a lot of differences on that, on claims questions, on fugitives, on Guantanamo. So there's a lot of road before the next step, but this is still historic. It's a scene setter, and the drama that comes will, to some extent, depend on the presidential election.
That's Portia, right. That's to Pamela's point, Portia. I want to ask you some of those dissidents, the ladies in white. I had heard, they go ahead and protest most Sundays, but they protested after a Palm Sunday service earlier, and we've been hearing that a number of them were arrested, and that it was a little bit more. That they wanted it to be noticed that these people were being arrested, that there was almost a cleanup in a way. Can you talk about that?
Definitely, and I'll say that the streets are basically pretty empty of people right at this moment, and there is a large police presence through much of the city. They have always said, the Cubans, that the streets belong to the whole Cuban population, not to what they call the small dissident minority on the payroll of the United States. That's their position on it, and they actually made it a point about their independent foreign policy by having the president of Venezuela fly in the day before yesterday and having him meet with Raul Castro and meet with Fidel Castro. Today's local media is filled with photos of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and Fidel Castro. So it's sort of, they've been emphasizing we remain an independent country even though we won. And they clearly do improve relations with the United States. And they're not going to, as Pamela said, allow meddling in their domestic or their international policy. And both sides say they have differences, but I think on the U.S. point of view, there's been no success by not having relations and changing Cuba. And the Cuban point of view has always been, they're only 90 miles away. Someday they're going to have to recognize us and reestablish relations. So it's on both sides. Let's try a new tactic and see where we can get from here.
If Fidel Castro met with the Venezuelan president just yesterday, do you think that he could pop up anywhere here, Pamela? Do you think that...
I would not be surprised if there is an unexpected meeting with Fidel Castro. This is historic. It just may have more to do with his own state of health and everything else, where they feel more comfortable with the Venezuelans, clearly, than they would with the American media seeing him in a state of disrepair or health problems. But what's interesting about this last point is that there are two groups that feel like they want to make sure they're in if this whole country does move forward. And there are going to be a lot of obstacles before that happens because the government itself wants to hold on to these. They're mainly what we're looking at is joint ventures. And it's a long road before the actual trade embargo gets lifted. Let's say that. And Americans can't go for tourism purposes, although Americans love to go everywhere. But it's expanding. Now, the two groups are the Cuban Americans who have been hurt and really a personal affront, everything that happened in the past years, but many are looking to go back in. And then there's also the Cuban people who feel like they don't want just foreign enterprises without feeling it, and they haven't seen anything yet. So there's a lot out there in terms of what people are hoping this scene setter means.
Well, it seems that younger Cuban Americans have really driven a lot of this, because if you talk to older Cuban Americans, they remember, the fight between the two countries, and they remember the Cold War, and they remember some of the really horrible things that happened under the Castro regime.
And you can't leave out the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, that is an affront to the mainland of the United States that hasn't been seen since, in the sense of nuclear weapons pointed at the United States. So there are a lot of people of older generation that really lived it, some who were young people at the time, and that really set the scene, in addition to all of the other problems between the U.S. and Cuba during the Castro early years. But there's a real sense that that was the Soviet Union. Times have changed. And so a lot of the Congress people you see, Senator Leahy and Flake and Senator Durbin and Congresswoman Pelosi, they're looking to preserve trade between, or reestablish trade between, some of the agricultural interests in the United States, the telecommunications, and the hotel industry.
Well, I want to talk about the list, of people that are traveling on this trip to Cuba as well. I mean, it's a very lengthy list of senators and representatives, and it's both Democrats and Republicans. But if you look at the list, I think what struck me right away was that there are a number from the Midwest and there are a number of agricultural interests.
Precisely.
Is that why these people were chosen, as well as political interests here?
Yes, absolutely. They've been at the forefront, and this goes back to the Freedom to Farm Act back in the 90s, when the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress said they can deal with industries and the subsidies would be cut, and they would deal with governments where there had been trade restrictions. And so first came Vietnam and then came Cuba, and they really felt that with the subsidies cut, they really wanted to trade with Cuba. So some have been dealing in humanitarian contributions for several decades with Cuba, but now they're ready to see if they can actually trade. So that's where you see a big congressional push for many years in trying to lift the embargo.
Well, and that's, Portia, I want to talk about some of the business leaders as well that have come on this trip. Quite interesting. Jose Andres, the chef, pretty big name. But Saul Bernthal, he was born and raised in Cuba, came to the U.S. in 1960. He wants to go with his company and introduce farm manufacturing equipment. So it speaks to that point of wanting to get agricultural interests in there. You also have the CEO of Xerox. You have then, though, Airbnb. You have a health insurance company, a clothing manufacturer, and then loans to entrepreneurs. When you take a look at the diverse list of businesses that want to come into Cuba, what does that say to you?
Well, it's really very interesting because a lot of the people, and not necessarily in this delegation, have been coming down, are very wealthy Cuban Americans who lost a lot of property in Cuba and are now acting as consultants, bringing in big business from the U.S. And they're looking to invest in the future of Cuba, that they see a future for a new Cuba rather than reclaiming their properties. And so the Cuban interest is certainly in food production and agricultural production and in a number of industrial areas, such as packaging, which they need desperately. Cannot imagine the food crops that are lost, guavas and tomatoes left rotting in the fields because they don't have any way of packaging them, canning them. So there's a great interest to bring in business to attract those investments. But to me, one of the most interesting things is how many Cuban Americans are involved in this process, encouraging it, and how many Cuban Americans have come in to witness this visit. And one of them said to me the other day, this is like the final knife blow, the final stabbing of the older exile community that's against the renewal of relations, because while they may be complaining on the exile hardline radio stations, there are no protests in the streets of Miami. The younger generation absolutely is not against the visit. They point out how Marco Rubio lost every county except for Dade County in the primaries. And they're saying this is a new era, and Cuban Americans want to be part of moving forward and investing in the future of the island.
Along those lines, Portia, while you're speaking, I just want to point out that live on your screen right now is the President and Mrs. Obama with their daughter, Sasha Malia, walking down off Air Force One, and for the first time in nearly 90 years, a U.S. president will step foot on Cuban soil. You can see him being greeted there. It's apparently raining. Portia, you can probably speak to that a little bit better, but the umbrellas have come out right there on the ground, as you can see, and them being greeted there at the bottom of the stairs of Air Force One.
Greeted, yeah, by the Cuban foreign minister is there, and the head of the U.S. desk at the Cuban foreign ministry. It's definitely a foreign ministry delegation, a protocol delegation that's greeting them. The weather has been threatening rain, and we've all been worried. The people that are going out and, doing their live shots reporting from Havana are also under umbrellas at this point. But everyone's quite beaming, as you can see on the screen, looking very happy. That's Josefina Vidal, the head of the U.S. desk in the Cuban Foreign Ministry, greeting the Obamas now. And that is her second-in-command, Gustavo Machin. So it's not the presidential Jose Cabañas, who's the ambassador of Cuba in the United States. This is all new. This is amazing.
As you both know, the U.S. has established diplomatic relations, but to get an ambassador there takes Senate approval, and that hasn't happened yet. Jeff De Laurentiis, who is the chief of mission, will continue to act sort of in an ambassadorial capacity, and that's where President Obama and the First Lady will be staying with the family. They will be meeting there. And that's an interesting point. It never changed. It just changed flags during the period of break of relations.
Pamela, I just want to go ahead and bring in CBS News Foreign Affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan, who is in Havana. Margaret, can you describe what you're seeing?
Hi. Well, as you can see, the heavens have opened up here in Havana. It's been sunny and humid all day, but as the president made history with that touchdown, the skies really opened up here. But there has been a tremendous amount of anticipation, as Portia was telling you, for this visit to happen. It was a long road to get here as well, since that 2014 decision to reopen diplomatic relations. And frankly, it hasn't been an easy thing to negotiate for most of the American officials you talk to, because every little change has involved massive bureaucratic unwinding back in the U.S. because that trade embargo is still there, and the president has really tried to figure out what he can do because he's so limited by that trade embargo, but how much he can do on this end. And there's been some frustration on the administration's side that Cuba hasn't adapted fast enough. You see that Cuban foreign minister there. You see some of the negotiators who have helped open it up. But frankly, a lot of the bureaucracy hasn't caught up with the policy just yet. And so with this visit, President Obama and his administration really want to reach out to the Cuban people. They've been talking to the Castro government, but now they are here to reach out to the Cuban people to say, look, you have blamed the United States for so long for your economic hardship because of that economic embargo. We're here now. This is a new era. We want to change things as much as we can, which is why that business delegation is so notable, that the president is trying to gather here to teach people about entrepreneurship, to encourage more private ownership to the degree that the Cuban government will allow it. In what was a really communist country for decades, they're trying to experiment a little bit with capitalism. And that's something that the administration is trying to encourage, because they think if they can deepen those financial ties, it will make this policy change irreversible, not just in Washington for the next president to have a hard time undoing beneficial business for American businesses, but also here in Cuba, because it will, they think, pressure the Cuban government to adapt for that next generation, because it's hard to pull back on what is the promise of more economic freedom. But, you know, this hasn't been without controversy. There were some limited protests today, as often happens on Sundays in Havana. And there are those who fear that by opening up and outstretching a hand to Cuba and the Cuban people, that the administration may be empowering the Castro government. So that is a concern. One other interesting thing that we've seen on U.S. shores as a result of this policy, some would say, or simply at the same time as this policy change, is a very substantial uptick in record numbers of Cubans heading to the U.S. For American shores. Because remember, the other U.S. law that is still in place allows Cubans that wet foot, dry foot policy to become American citizens, basically if they can make it to American shores. Something that's a refugee policy that favors Cubans over virtually every other group of migrants to the U.S. And that's also controversial. So you've seen a number of Cubans fleeing for the U.S. Since that 2014 reopening. And some say maybe that's a sign that the economic benefits haven't trickled down. Some say maybe that's just fear that American policy might change more. But it's a lot of uncertainty, and this visit today is a hugely symbolic one. But there is so much promise yet to be delivered on. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the next president.
Well, Margaret, too, as you're speaking right now, we're watching, the president leave the airport now. He's headed to the Catholic Church there in Havana. He's going to meet with a cardinal. Can you talk about the role the Catholic Church played in having these two countries come together?
A huge one. This is an overwhelmingly Catholic country, and the Vatican itself played a huge role in trying to facilitate that diplomatic reopening. Remember, these were secret talks leading up to that 2014 surprise declaration by Raul Castro and President Obama that they were going to try to reestablish ties. And some of those secret talks were facilitated by the Vatican because they do have entree to the Castro government, to Raul Castro, the brother of Fidel, the revolutionary who as a result of his coming to power and establishing communism, led the U.S. to cut ties. And they can freely talk to the United States, to the highest powers in the land. So it was an interesting thing to see that the Vatican took on this very strong diplomatic role, whether it was ferrying back and forth letters of intent, really sort of establishing some, you could say, credibility for what the U.S. was saying it wanted to do. And it took a lot of trust. And the Vatican sort of lent that moral authority to say, listen, they're serious about this. The United States really does want to test this out. President Obama campaigned promising that he would look at trying to reach out and talk to some of America's longtime foes, whether it was Iran.